Perfect.
10 or 15, you see.
Okay. Agradecemos su presencia a la presentación del libro de Kerry Palani, una traducción donde participó fundamentalmente el equipo de Ola Financiera. Y para esta presentación del libro contamos con Alain Pargués, un economista que no se hace llamar economista, y también tenemos con nosotros a Mario Secarecha, un insistente promotor de pensamiento heterodoxo, sobre todo en política monetaria y temas que ha agobiado al mundo, que es el tema de la financiarización. Igualmente está con nosotros Wesley Marshall, uno de los militantes de Ola Financiera, profesor de la UAM Ixtapalapa. Le daremos primero la palabra a el profesor Alain Pargués. Él ha trabajado desde 1973 sobre temas financieros y temas de la austeridad, hoy tan en boga en el mundo. Y además él ha propuesto una interpretación del proceso financiero, monetario, bancario, a través de lo que se le llama la teoría circuitista del dinero o la teoría del circuito del dinero. Entonces, vamos a darle la palabra a Alain Pargués.
Thank you very much. I shall start by adding something to what I said yesterday. Our last philosopher, Jean-Paul Sartre, in his last book, Critique de la raison dialectique, calls at least 5 times Kerry Palani, because Sartre said maybe Kerry Palani is a greater mind than Marx, because he perfectly understood that the sole existent condition to be an economist is just to work for a genuinely better society. Economic and social policy are the raison d'être of true economists. So, as I said, for an eternity, I looked at Kerry as my soulmate. The first time I heard about his father was in my early house. I was in the course of reading Marx's Capital, and I had some problems with the theory of labor value and Marx's vision of history. So I told my mother, who was a deep thinker, dedicated Marxist, that there were some parts of Marx I didn't understand, and she told me, you have to read The Great Transformation. So I do think that the reason why we are in such a time of disaster is that we don't have enough Kerry Palani. Now we are suffering from a new order that could be deemed modern fascism, the totalitarian neoliberal ideology, which, while it lacks any kind of rational, logical foundation, is the totalitarian order imposing austerity on society and the absolute totalitarian rule of markets. The reason why I am deeply shocked by most of my colleagues, excepting indeed Mario, is that when they deemed themselves to be heterodox, everybody knows that the so-called orthodox economists are paid by the ruling class. They become extremely rich, so it's a perfect waste of time to be interested into microeconomics and their absurd macroeconomic teaching. The problem is that too many heterodox are completely forgetting what is our mission, not to build super abstract and models. Failed mathematicians are the plague of modern heterodox economists. What we need is, and it was my case, to be interested into history, sociology, philosophy, culture, and I never believed that I should work to be a member of the profession of economist. It is an absurd. I became economist after a long time of working and research, and I sworn to myself that I will dedicate my life to a fight against the dark, devilish, totalitarian forces which are destroying completely society. It is exactly, I think, the core of Kerry Palani, a book and lifelong research. This night I read with passion a part of the book of Kerry Palani. What a great mind when I consider people believing in nothing, proposing nothing, accepting the reality, which is completely dark. So we have unceasingly to fight those dark and destroying forces. You could say that there is a paradox, since in this age of austerity, the state dismantled themselves. Central banks becoming independent and Lord's protector of the banking and financial system. The state strive to become small and minimalist state by cancelling as long as they could public expenditures, excepting indeed a military and security, but the destruction of the raison d'être of the state has been completely suppressed. But the minimalist state are at the same time ultra-authoritarian and completely devoted to crush the people by imposing at any cost the so-called market laws and the rule of finance. The sole mission of the state rulers, of the symbiosis between the so-called new transformational capitalism and the state, is that the state, without the full support of the state, destroying all kind of social welfare expenditures, the new capitalism will be dead. So I must say bravo to Kerry and bravo to Mario, and indeed bravo to the Mexican intellectual establishment.
Agradecemos las palabras del profesor Alain Pargués. El libro ya se encuentra traducido y a la venta por la editorial El Fondo de Cultura Económica. A la salida hay un representante de la casa editorial quien está interesado en comprarlo y que Kerry Palani les dé un recordatorio en sus libros, una anotación en sus libros, pues quizás sea una buena oportunidad. Hola Financiera agradece a Kerry Palani por haber cedido la primicia en castellano para la revista Hola Financiera, que se publicó en varias entregas, como se hacía en el siglo XIX, de manera digital en www.holafinanciera.unam.mx. Sin más comentarios, le daremos la palabra a el doctor Wesley Marshall. Adelante.
Good morning, everyone. It's a great honor to be here in this table with three great thinkers who come from abroad, one from home, all of whom have been very helpful to me personally in my research and furthering my interests, and I know to many of our colleagues and students here as well. So it's a great honor to be here. And it's also a great honor to be celebrating 10 years of Ola Financiera, where fortunately we have been able to publish works from everyone here, and they have been very valuable for our students and our researchers here. I really do think that Ola Financiera, along with Mario's journal, if we're going to read one journal or two to understand the current crises, I think we have two great guides in those two journals. So I want to thank everyone here for being so generous with Ola Financiera, and I guarantee that it has been of great service to everyone here. So it's a great moment. But today especially, we're here to celebrate Kerry Palani, so I wanted to gear my short intervention into saying a few words about the book that we just presented last night. I don't want to personalize things too much, but I will a little bit, because I was involved in the translation, and I really do think it was, well, I don't think it was, because I'm talking about myself. It was an interesting experience for me because I actually had read The Great Transformation maybe 10 years before I published your book. And we all have different moments in our development, but maybe it wasn't the right time, I don't know. But translating your book really was a second introduction for me for The Great Transformation. And I think taking the two books together really strengthens both of them individually. Maybe it's only because it's from my experience, but I would probably recommend reading yours first and then going back to the original one, but I'm sure that's a decision for each person. But taken together, I think they are a great, I would go a little further than Alain. I think it's a great antidote for Marx. I think we always have to separate an author and its public, but I'm not always the biggest fan of our current Marxists, and I think they make a lot of mistakes. I think they take a lot of wrong roots from Marx that can be corrected with Polanyi. But I don't want to talk about that too much. I want to talk about a different theme, which is a universal concept of development, which I think is also a very important line that we can continue following, especially from your book, which I think is much more explicit than in your father's book. I did want to share a couple of my favorite lines, I think, to understand today's financialization. I'm convinced that all of the bad guys are well-versed in George Orwell's 1984. And as I told you before, it was a great pleasure for me to see when you made a reference in the 70s that the only way that we were going to be able to roll out on a global scale this new mode of production that was going to impoverish the whole world was to accompany it with a Orwellian type police state, which I think we have. So that was fun. I also, in the Orwellian vein, I love the concept of the mental proletariat, the people who do not have the mental means of production and are willing to have that done for them by the people who would wish to manipulate people. And in our post-truth Trump days, that's, I think, very relevant. But what I found most useful for me, and I'm sure many other people do, I think it's very important when we're discussing money to firmly establish it as a social convention. And to have you do that so explicitly in your book allows people like me, who rightfully don't have the voice that you do and the recognition, to use that and to have a very solid starting point for making those arguments. But what I really wanted to talk about, and and I'll only talk about it for 5 minutes because my preamble has taken up most of the time, is that I love the concept that capital is that which alienates, and that which separates the nature of things from the reality of things. One of my big problems in Marx is that my feeling is, well, so we have a few things. Obviously, alienation, we would have work. I really do like to mix a little E.F. Schumacher in with your work. I love the idea of work as the basis of human dignity, and that's the nature of work. But when we alienate work, it becomes the terrible work that we all are accustomed with. And if we only, as people, think that work is terrible, then we're happy to give up our jobs to robots, as we were talking about yesterday, and that's certainly not a way forward for humanity. Human nature is another very interesting one. And recently, I've gotten to read a good number of things regarding the vested interest in presenting humans as bad by nature. Because when humans are bad by nature, we need someone to govern over us. And who can govern over us, or who should in the natural order? Obviously, it's the rich should govern all of us, and I think we probably all disagree with that. But I do also think that that is present in Marx, that humans by nature, we're not good, and we will need some great social transformation in our nature to make us good. And I think it's a much easier route and a much more correct way of thinking of things, as that humans are good by nature, but we have been ruined by capital. And I think a very easy proof of that is when we think of what is good and bad, usually we think of good as being altruistic, helping out our fellow human. And I think, as we all know, humans are very social animals. We watch nature videos. A horse is born and it's running, but people, we need a good 5 years before we can do anything. The only strength we have as human beings is that we are cohesive and we are social and we can protect each other. And so we have to be good by nature because we're not sharks. Sharks can be bad by nature and survive, but humans, we had to be good by nature to evolve into not be eaten by sharks or other animals that would be more likely to eat humans on Earth. So I think that's a great way to, one anecdote to Marx and one of the great uses of this concept that capital is that which alienates. And we can also use it in money. Obviously, my favorite quote ever on money is by E.F. Schumacher, which is, money is a wonderful servant, but a terrible master. And I think the nature of money should be abundant at the service of humanity rather than humanity kneeling down to its own creation. And I think taken together, both of the books, there are a great number of academic points that are very important, and I think that can lead us towards a better understanding of economics. But the main point now, which I will make in 2 minutes, is I think your book in particular, and you as a person, do lead us towards what could be an appreciation of, I would like to say, something like a universal theory of development. Being in Mexico, not being a Mexican or a Latin American, it's been a great benefit for me to get to know the Latin American structuralist school. And I think the best definition of that is the study of underdevelopment. And I think if we take Latin America as a geographical region with its unique history, I think the structuralists are very important in that. But I think we could take that as a subset of the whole of development theory, Because it certainly is interesting to take a step back and look at the history of development theory as a whole. I was surprised to learn how young it was. It really only begins basically with Rostow in the post-World War II, a very U.S. officialistic manufactured area of study. And it is always curious to me that supposedly studying development, we only study countries that have never developed. Why don't we study England in the 19th century like your father did? That's a case of development. All we ever study is countries that have never developed. But so if we could take this more universal theme, I think we can have really break out almost all of the important developments of capitalist economies or development anywhere into their nature, in their reality, and see how capital does transform, degrade, and mutilate all of these processes. For example, I am very much in agreement with Alain Pargues that monetary policy should never be used, has no use. It certainly does for banks, but that for me would be an alienated public policy. A real public policy should be fiscal policy so that we can all live a little bit better, and not monetary policy so that banks can make more money. Also, when we are in the reality of Latin American countries, we all often see these great projects that are destined towards develop a country, like a giant new airport in the middle of a bird-laden swamp. But if we look at that as alienated development, I think it could make more sense. We have a good development and a bad development. The bad development is to enrich a small group of people, whereas good development would be for the nation as a whole. So I really do like, I think it's very useful both for me and I'm sure for many other people who have had the privilege of being able to incorporate your work in their studies, these concepts. And all I really wanted to do was to bring out some of my favorite ones, and I think some lines of investigation that these can greatly contribute to. Also, just on a personal note, one of the best things about this job is being able to meet such great people. So it has been a great pleasure to be able to meet you and share some ideas, some laughs, hear some stories, and I will leave with a quote by Edith Wharton that says there are two ways of spreading light in the world. One is to be the candle, and the other is to be the mirror. And I think you're probably one of the few people in the world who are both a candle and a mirror. The mirror shedding the light of your father's work, and the candle shedding your own light on how these processes have worked. So it's been a great pleasure for me, I'm sure for a lot of other people, and thank you very much.
Muchas gracias a Wesley Marshall. Como lo han planteado más o menos nuestros dos primeros comentaristas, de la gran transformación a la gran financiarización, es un análisis de los mecanismos materiales e ideológicos que hacen visible el sometimiento al poder político y económico que ha impuesto a las sociedades el sistema financiero, particularmente en los últimos 10 años. Tanto el doctor Alain Pargues como el doctor Mario Secarecha han sido promotores de Ola Financiera, han participado, han escrito, han puesto a discusión sus propuestas y les agradecemos, igual que a Wesley Marshall, y le daremos la palabra a el doctor Mario Secarecha, que nos dirá algunas palabras de este libro tan importante. Gracias.
Gracias, Sergio. Excuse me. I risk repeating things because we already had some comments to make last night. But I will start with one that will be partly a repetition, of course, which has to do with my connection with Kerry, which goes back literally to the late 60s. I hadn't met her then, but I was a student. I was an undergraduate student. And
In the 60s.
in the late 60s, in 69. And there was a book that came out in which she was involved, edited book. And I had read, I had looked at it, at the time. I think it came out, it was published in 67 or something, on the Canadian economy. And I was interested, in the whole bit. And and it's from there that in my third year as an undergraduate, I decided that I would take her course. And this was in the academic year of 1971-72. And at the time, she was, in fact, she had put together a course which was quite unique. Just from the title, it was a very unusual one. Yeah? And it was very intriguing for me because I didn't have a clue what to expect. Yeah? Very naive about it. But for sure, a most intriguing title by the name of the Economics of Dependency in the Western Hemisphere. And this course really was innovative because at the time, there was nothing like it, really, that I could remember. And not only was there nothing like it, but what's interesting is that Kerry was the pioneer of what I would argue is that discipline, so to speak, that evolved, that now you have all kinds of programs that exist, and I'm sure even at UNAM here and elsewhere, we have it in our own university, of course, which has to do with international development, globalization, and so on. This is very common now. But at the time, it was something that nobody talked about. There would be a course in international trade, probably never in international finance even. That was something that came later. And I'm just saying here, this was something which was extremely unique because it had to do with aspects of dependency and control exercised by multinational corporations, and especially in the developing world. We were learning all kinds of stuff about plantation economies and how they were integrated within this sort of world system and so on. And as I said, this was something extremely interesting, and it was unique to her, of course, but the ideas behind that and the broad perspective of looking at and analyzing the world in this kind of more global kind of perspective, hemispheric, whatever you want to call it, perspective, was something that you find originally in their course. Okay? And this, unfortunately, this was at the time was in an economics department. But what we have seen, at least in our university, and I think it's a case for a lot of universities, okay? Perhaps not here in Mexico, but for sure in Canada and the United States, I would say, generally, okay? Which is, or perhaps even in Europe, but I'm less clear there, which is that you have none of this being discussed in economics departments anymore, which is scary. I mean, you would think that this is something that is of relevance for economics student. And now it's true that it has become more interdisciplinary, which is a very good thing. For sure, it's a very good thing. But it's also true that this is something that is in the domain of economic analysis. And it should be also in the economics sphere, not something that now has completely disappeared. So they're going to talk about international trade. What the hell do they talk about? The Ricardian model to all this not just ideology basically, or fairy tales often. Okay, but when it comes to actually understanding the world around us, well, you're going to have a hard time trying to dig that in through the equations there, or through some of the empirical work they show that often has nothing to do with what they're actually theorizing about. Okay? So it is a sad state, but as I said, Kerry, of course, was an innovator. And now I'd like to say something briefly about the book. It is a book that, of course, I mean, there are, three major sections there. I did mention that and it has been mentioned already, actually, that there are, in the first part of the book, it's really it's on the intellectual heritage of Kerry Palani. Okay? It's about what I think Kerry learned from her dad, but also within that tradition as it established itself. And the second part, instead, is really all the stuff, as I was saying, that she was already discussing in 1971, 72 when I was taking the course. Okay? Not in its form that it takes in the book, but it's this kind of interest, this domain of study here, of analysis, okay, that one finds the second part of the book, rather, that looks at the intellectual traditions of many of the developing economies. Actually, I'd like to correct for one minor thing. It's not from Rostow that it starts with development there. I mean, much earlier than that, okay? And by actually much more interesting people than Rostow, who was just part of the, paid by the CIA or whatever it is there. I don't know who he was paid by, okay? No, this is much earlier. And indeed, in the traditions, going back to, I mean, whatever, like her own teacher, like Arthur Lewis, I would say, Raul Prebisch, in Latin America, for sure, Celso Furtado in Latin America. This is later, of course, in the case of Furtado, okay? More of the generation of Rostow, okay? But that whole second part of the book is about all that, I would say, with an added feature, which has to do with the financial side as well, because, much of development theorizing has to do with both understanding, if you take the Rostovian, it's about stages of development and all that, or by looking at strategic models of development, like, export-led growth models and all this sort of stuff, okay? And these, as much as they are important in understanding, and indeed, I mean, we have our own tradition in Canada here with the Staples approaches, for instance, okay, which is another connected tradition in that, that whole, broad view on development theories. And again, based on this, for instance, in this case, about export-led growth models here. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that that side of it was studied by these people to some extent, looking at the vulnerabilities of these countries that we're trying to develop based on these kind of models of development, okay? On trade especially. But of course, there's another side which Kerry talks about, but which they clearly did not very much talk about, which is the financial side. And how financialization, in a sense, has brought a new element of vulnerability for these countries, internationally. So in that sense, I would say here that this is something that is integrated in a way which is critically important to understand, okay? But I'd like to finish here with just to talk briefly about something that is more, and obviously it's connected with the first half of the book, which has to do with the Palanian tradition here. And it's close to me because, of course, we just wrote a paper there that we recently wrote a paper, which came out in Spanish on Monday, and it was a wonderful timing for us. Okay, that Kerry and I wrote on neoliberalism, okay, and the kind of Palanian tradition of analyzing, and. In fact, what we did in that paper, and obviously I'd love to encourage everybody to read, not just our paper, but the whole issue, or indeed OLA generally, okay? But indeed, it is about trying to make sense of one, what happened? like, how do we get to this mess? Okay, the way I look at it. Okay? But also trying to get inspired here from the work of Kerry Palani. Okay? Trying to pick up on some of that in order to be able to ultimately be able to shed light on this kind of evolution that took place and maybe what to fear or expect, you know, in the future, so to speak, here as well. And here, now, we did say, first of all, in fact, it's already in her book, you know, that the translation of it, I think you left it that way, which is that neoliberalism is not some very refined kind of theorizing. You know, it's like, you know, Alain Valrasian sort of general equilibrium theory or some kind of thing. Okay? No, it's more, as Kerry writes in her introduction, if I remember correctly, it's a thought collective, okay? Which is a term that also people like Murawski have used. Philip Murawski's used. And it's a thought collective, meaning it's kind of it's fragmented, but it comes together in some way here. And there's obvious logic here, as we'll see. But the logic, as I said, is part of this sort of process of you know, dialectical process that we're going to talk about briefly, okay, in the paper. Okay. Now, what Kerry Palani has taught us is that when we look at the evolution of capitalism, okay, particularly, I mean, Kerry in her book goes back all the way to the sort of mercantilist era, okay, its origin. But by the 19th century, when Kerry Palani is studying the evolution of capitalism, the institutions of capitalism, and indeed the socio-economic order that dominated that period, or indeed any historical period, it can be said, do not have some simple, almost natural existence, which the founders, let's call them, of neoliberalism, like what people like Hayek and von Mises and so on there, these people instead, that's what they promoted as a view, that it was part of almost spontaneous order. There's a process of learning going on, you know, that ultimately leads markets to, you know, shape things in such a way that it evolves to whatever is the ideal mode that exists there almost, okay? In this kind of evolutionary process. Well, while there is an evolutionary process, what Kerry Palani taught us, in fact, that if you look at the way in which they set up these structures, it was something that there were certain intellectuals, obviously, who promoted, designed it, and ultimately, politically, were there to get it through. And we see that in the 19th century, and we see that obviously in the 20th and 21st century. That hasn't changed. What has changed, obviously, is we're at different levels here of discussions about it, but in both cases, we have the same kind of thing going on here, is that you have certain people, let's say in Ricardian England or something, that's in the 19th century, that ultimately try to shape certain structures, okay, that at the time, nobody would have actually imagined that to be a natural thing. I mean, the notion, and this is where Kerry Palani made it so important, was the notion, let's say, for instance, of what he calls fictitious commodities, okay, whereby they created markets, they designed these markets. That's the important thing, okay, in a way to shape them so that you could now ultimately be able to, you know, lead to certain types of developments that were of interest to, obviously, serving certain interests at the time, needless to say, okay? But these structures, so the notion of a labor market as if somehow this is a natural thing, was an absurdity for people there. I mean, Marx talks about it as being something, he talks about labor market, but he didn't think it was a natural thing. But it happened, okay, as a result of design, which is what Palani emphasized, Okay? Well, in the case of Marx, it's more ambiguous. I mean, this guy is obviously looking at this sort of historical process of materialism and so on, which leads to a certain view here as if it was something that was emerging already in the late Middle Ages or whatever. So again, there are differences, but you could see even within these left-leaning political economists how this notion of natural systems here almost is something that that markets for labor, land, money, whatever, that these are somehow things that should be, or just something that just evolved. Okay? Just like financialization is something that they will say just evolved. It didn't just evolve. Okay? And in fact, what's more important to understand here is that if we were to emulate, and if the process of development should be that we should follow the way in which the so-called developed countries evolve, then we should all be embracing financialization and think this is the most wonderful thing under the sun, which I know, if that were the way, if we would think of it, very few people would take us, as I said, would take us seriously as development theorists, right? This is not what we want. We want something. I'm sorry?
We'd make more money.
Yes, you want yes, more money, but it's going to be for the few. And so how much, okay, well, time is up here, okay. Well, I wanted to mention a little bit how we, in fact, just give me 1 minute and I'll, which is that we evolved, okay, and if you look at it the way Palani looks at the world, okay, evolved, in fact, along these lines of, yes, there are those who are trying to shape certain structures, and then there's those who are sort of reacting to it. And the response, the double movement or whatever, is the way in which ultimately there's going to be an evolutionary process taking place. I mean, things will, and what we found, of course, historically, is that we went from the sort of 19th century version of the liberal creed, as he called it, to these reformed capitalism of the 20th century, and especially after the Second World War, that did provide certain goods, certain welfare here that had not existed hitherto because of the response. Okay? And now what we've seen is same kind of phenomenon with neoliberalism. And we discuss, and I will not go through it, we don't have time, but I would certainly encourage you to read that paper because we actually try to make sense of it along the same lines as Palani originally had done. So for the 19th century liberal creed, we did it for the 20th, 21st century neoliberal creed. Okay, thank you very much.
Le damos las gracias al doctor Mario Secarecha. El libro de Kerry Palani, de la gran transformación a la gran financiarización, sin duda que lo que nos presenta es un horizonte, como lo han señalado nuestros comentaristas, un horizonte histórico que incluye a lo que le llama el sur global. Pero además de ello, y que también resulta, me parece importante, es remarcar la responsabilidad que ha tenido el pensamiento dominante en economía en la conducción de la economía. Sin la crítica, sin las observaciones hacia el pensamiento dominante en economía y el contexto actual en el cual nos encontramos, pues me parece a mí que da una visión más completa de lo que es el hacer la economía y el analizar la economía. Le daremos la palabra a nuestra autora y le reiteramos nuestras gracias. Thanks for giving us this book. It's very, very interesting and important for the global south, I think. Thank you.
Thank you for all of the interesting comments that were made this morning. I want to be quite brief. First, I want to say that I wish to thank from the bottom of my heart what was done here, the kind of reception which my book has received by colleagues in the Faculty of Economics that they thought it would be worth to translate it on their own initiative, that this was involved several people and produced what I am told is an excellent translation, and that we now have from the Fondo Cultura, a beautifully produced volume, which actually also resembled the book of my father, The Great Transformation. I must tell you that nowhere in the world, as far as I'm concerned, has shown the appreciation, the recent appreciation of my father's work, and certainly nowhere has shown appreciation of my work in the way in which it has happened here in Mexico. The kind of panel, particularly the one we had last night on the premises of the publisher, the Fondo, of a quality, intellectual quality, and attention paid to this book of mine that has not happened anywhere in Canada where I live, or as far as I know in the United States, where I don't live and don't want to even go there. I do think the first part of the book is a very useful introduction to the world of thought of Kerry Palani. And perhaps those of you who have not read yet The Great Transformation will find it useful to take those 8 chapters of my book as a kind of introduction. You see, the important thing to understand about the work of Kerry Palani and his methodology is that the problem he set himself throughout his life is to study the place of the economy in society. The place of the economy within society, and he studied that in more primitive societies, in ancient empires, and then, of course, in the modern capitalist world. But at the base is not the economy. In that sense, that is a difference, perhaps, from the Marxist way of looking at the base, where that seems to be the technology as a base and social institutions as a kind of superstructure. More turn this around and consider the society that we live in is the base of everything that is created within that society. What arises of different forces and classes and conflicts and resolutions and political organization out of society. I like to say that Kerry Palani is the answer to Margaret Thatcher's statement, which is a declaration of neoliberalism, when she said, there is no such thing as society. No such thing as society. There are only individuals and families. And families and individuals, big collective ensemble of families and individuals, that is society. There is nothing that is added simply to the sum of individuals. And Palani's position is that that is not so. Society is real. Society is capable of producing movements and actions and reactions. We heard about the double movement as a reaction to the market forces. It is a reaction from the depth of society. And to come to more current issues, there is much discussion going on now of what is the origin of the nationalistic populist appeal of personalities such as Mr. Trump and others in other parts of the world. Palani would say it is a reaction of society to pressures upon us in society, and we are reacting in some way. There are so many things I could say about this book, but I think you have to understand that every essay, every chapter in the book is really, originally was a talk given somewhere, or it was a paper written. Each one, I would like to think, can be read on its own and consider what it says. The last chapter is in a way a summary, and it is entitled The Decline of the West and the Rise of the Rest. And it is based on my understanding of history. I see that the West, of course, rose together with the time of the Industrial Revolution, and the enormous technological advances were made, increased in production and population and so on and so forth. Yeah, but has been in decline. Well, it's questionable where you want to say. I would say perhaps since the whole era of the 1930s, certainly since the 1970s. Since the 1970s, which is the beginning of the implementation of neoliberal policies, starting, I think, in the United States, with the reforms of the system of taxation, where the rich people who at the beginning of the 80s paid 70% of their income in income tax, and by the end of the decade, that was down to like 28% or something, very, very little. And because the government now has foregone a lot of revenue, they increase borrowing, and they're borrowing on the capital market, and we begin the story of increasing debts, most of them private, most of them debts of household, of course, debts of companies. Companies must borrow money. That is a part of the process of production. It begins by borrowing funds, make investments and set production in process. The majority of borrowing is private, but then there is also the governments that increasingly borrow funds. And as they borrow, they become increasingly captive to the financial institutions which are managing the world of finance and which have become increasingly powerful, immensely powerful, and have influence over governments, over their policies, and in many ways over the outlook of the public servants. And I hate to say, but one of the ways in which this influence manifests itself is through some of the training students receive in economics. Economics has become such a narrow field of study. It is all based on the principle of scarcity of markets, and you cannot have markets unless scarcity, so the idea always is to make something more efficient or cheaper. What I call the title of the book, it is From the Great Transformation to the Great Financialization. The Great Transformation comes from my father's book, and it refers to the developments from the from 1929 or 30, the time of the Great Depression, where there were efforts to reconstruct economies and societies. In the United States, it was by the New Deal. The most important thing that the New Deal did, in my opinion, is to legitimate labor. That is the labor and the trade unions and organized labor, which were quite highly organized in the United States from the 1930s onward, were given a legitimacy and a role in combination with capital, with business, by the New Deal legislation, together with, of course, direct employment by the state of people in all kinds of occupations. But this relationship between capital and labor that carried forward during the war in the United States and enabled the Americans to develop a very powerful state-led war effort. They came out of the war as the only major power in the world that had not suffered immense casualties, both material and personal. And what then came of these 30 that have been called these 30 golden years, very successful years of economic growth in which the benefits of productivity were shared by labor and capital. You had increased productivity, but you had increased real income of labor, increased wages, and of course increased returns of profits to capital also. And that relationship of what I like to call a historic compromise of capital and labor that was so successful in the United States, in Europe, and at the same time as in in developing countries, Latin America particularly, experienced also very strong economic growth with very positive increase for decade of the 50s and the 60s in GDP per capita. I'm sure some of you have studied that. And it is in contrast, in severe contrast with what happened then in the 80s and the 90s, where the neoliberal policies were implemented, the kind of the reduction of taxation on the well-to-do, the increased reliance increasingly on financial markets in terms of the increasing debt, but particularly in the 1990s, and particularly in the era of Clinton, and it continues. I had wanted to, that was something that was mentioned that I wanted to return to, but I cannot quite remember what it was. I think, yes, it was the important, the very important point was made, I think, by both the speakers, that the economy is a social construct, in a sense, actually a political construct also. There is nothing natural about markets. The industrial capitalism that was followed the Industrial Revolution and the discovery of the machinery that created a kind of an industrial working class, as distinct from working people of the artisanal era, in where many people had many trades and crafts and produced on the whole objects But now when we have the machine age, you begin to sell just labor power, hands. It's a very alienating, and that labor market was created by legislation and by parliamentary legislation in Britain, together with free trade and the gold standard. And these were the three pillars, as Palani called them, of how the economy was constructed. Now, we could talk about how these look today, but what the thought I would really like to leave you with, I think goes back to the success of the Western economies and developing world also in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, sometimes called the Keynesian consensus. Now, Keynes, who is, of course, extremely important, believed that capitalism was not the best, but the best that had been, the best that was available to mankind at the time. Provided, he said, it was well managed. By that meant, of course, that it had to be regulated. But he felt that the greatest danger to capitalism came from finance, which he considered that love of money and people who really just like to get rich and value money and like to deal in money is a kind of mental disorder. It's a sickness. Well, it seems to me that the type of financialization that has come to dominate our societies, that has come to create what really can be called a decadent, rentier type capitalism that we have globally, increasingly globally, is one dominated by finance. The whole structure of companies, of businesses, has been transformed by the fact that large finance complexes, pension funds and wealth funds and all kinds of funds invest in companies and dominate, so that we have this idea of increasing the value of the shares of the company. That's already a form of corruption. And then when people within the companies go to buy up the shares of the company to make it look more attractive for short-term gain on financial markets. I actually believe, if I could just share this last thought of mine, I don't have any evidence, but I think it is worth some research. I believe that the financialization on the scale it has happened and the magnitude, enormous magnitude of the income is in billions, it's absurd. I'll give you only one figure, that in earlier times, let's say the 50s or 60s, a manager of a large company was paid 40 times as much as a laborer. That ratio has increased to about 450 times more than a labor rate. I mean, you have utterly unthinkable, extraordinary inequalities. And of course, those who are in the top, not even 1%, less than 1%, become increasingly rich because the money they have earns more money and so forth. And my thought is that there has been a connection between this rate of financialization and between the complaint in almost every country you can go to of corruption. Now, corruption seems to be everywhere. Wherever you go and you ask people, what's the matter here? It's corruption. That was previously not the case. I don't say there was not corruption or complaints, but the universal phenomenon is obviously related to the increasing amount of financial transactions and the fact that incomes range in figures that are far beyond the needs or the ability of people who earn them to consume, and they have to find somewhere to park all that money to hide it from taxation. It invites corruption. So let me just stop it there. I hope you will enjoy reading the book. I have tried always to write in a way that is as clear as possible. I only want to communicate. I try to avoid economic jargon where possible and write in a way that my readers will enjoy what they read. Thank you.
Agradecemos estos comentarios, sugerencias de la profesora Kerry Palani. Les recordamos que el libro se encuentra fuera por si alguien quisiera que Kerry Palani le escribiera algunas palabras. Igualmente les recordamos que hay un curso que está impartiendo el doctor Alan Pargués en la Facultad de Economía, que continúa ahora mismo, y el curso del doctor Mario Secarecha, que continuará mañana y el viernes. Y además, si no pueden comprar hoy aquí el libro, lo pueden encontrar en la librería, pero también lo pueden encontrar en la página electrónica de Ola Financiera, www.olafinanciera.unam.mx, el número 25, 26 y 27, se publicaron estas entregas de, me parece a mí, un libro con bastante substancia para discutir y reflexionar históricamente y teóricamente la economía. Muchas gracias y hasta pronto.